or the extended theory that we've been talking about. It did it. It worked. There's no
Yeah.
reason to.
Now, of course, philosophically, the question that people will bring up, and I think it's a valid question is that create a moral hazard for the market to
Yes.
repeat its mistakes
Yes.
more quickly
Yes.
next time around? But the market's gonna go in cycles anyway. That this is kind of tinkering with the cycles basically.
Which
And
brings us to the closing segments of our interview in the final 15 minutes, because I knew we were working towards this, which is you. Well, let's talk about the numbers first. We're still about 1% to 1.5% above what is deemed. You did an article back at the end of May of what a normal foreclosure count looks like as compared to what doesn't, and that there were over 6 million foreclosures done over the last decade. I mean, that's a staggering number. That's a ridiculous number.
Mhm.
Yet those properties didn't seem to find their way back to the market, and we're seeing the effects of that today. I know that a lot of people, thanks to the Academy Award performances, people got to watch the Big Short, right? So people
Yeah.
got kind of hipped up to how the game was played, more or less, and the book's far better, but that's always the discussion. But they're right. We're
Yeah.
still a point and a half, we're a percentage and a half above what's deemed normal by foreclosures at default standards, right? We're still in that 3 to 4% range of people that are defaulting on their mortgages on a daily basis. I mean, the numbers are still pretty up there by normal standards, correct?
Well, no, not
No.
quite. I mean, I would say foreclosure starts are back to normal standards, and
Okay.
in fact below.
The
However, the
people in
people
default.
caught, yeah, the people in
Okay.
default and this kind of the deferred distress we've been talking about, people who have already gotten into trouble but have not been foreclosed on, that continues to be elevated. It's definitely nowhere close where it was at the peak of the crisis, but we're seeing um, that REO, well, the REO inventory, but also then the in default inventory. It's still at about 800,000 properties. Excuse me, that's including REO, but so it's about 500,000, as you said earlier, that are in foreclosure. Um,
480,000 the last time I went through your system. I love your
yeah,
system. 480,000.
yeah, you know these some of these numbers better than I do, but yeah, it's not completely gone away. It's this low grade fever type of situation with those, and the everybody was worried about the shadow inventory.
Yep.
You would think, well, you have 7 million homes
They got to be somewhere.
added to the mix. What's going to happen with those? But we really did not see that impact the market as some had predicted in a largely negative way. In fact, many people saw this as a buying opportunity and snatched up those properties very quickly, and have done very well by doing that. But then what you haven't seen is builders ramping up to to re, to increase inventory of overall housing stock by in a way that matches the population growth we've seen in the country. So those fundamentals have created this supply and demand balance that's much more weighted in favor of demand being stronger than supply, and then that's helping to push up home prices. And the properties that are still winding their way through the foreclosure process are, for the most part, pretty easy to sell.
One of the weird facts with your particular system, and maybe you can answer this, and maybe there's a simple answer to it. But when I was looking at, say, bank owned for the United States, as compared to those that actually have a less pendants notice of default or an auction date, the numbers are almost equal. I mean, plus or minus 30 or 40,000, but at that point, you're just kind of splitting hairs. But I noticed it on the city level as well as on the national level and even on the state level. Is there any kind of weird, kind of uh, sort of nerd economic reason why the number of bank owned properties seems to be almost the same balance as the number that is in active default?
Uh, yeah, that's I wouldn't call that normal. I think it's kind of
It's a weird fact that I just kept testing out again and
yeah.
again. And so something as small as a city like, say, Covina, California, where there's only 40 people with a sale or a notice of default, or, I think it was 60. By the same token, there's about 50 and change bank owned properties in the same city. It seems to be, uh, certainly they're not completely equal, but they're in the same area. And I was wondering if there
Right.
was some kind of freakonomic explanation for why that was.
You know, I think it has to do. I picture this as a pig and the python,
Okay.
and the if you looked at this a couple of years ago, you would have seen a lot more in that pre-foreclosure stage than REO stage, and but that pre-foreclosure stage has come down more quickly as properties have been pushed through. Now, the fact that the banks are not selling a lot of the REOs right away is I'm not sure as I can answer that fully, but
No,
when they take these properties back, they just don't. It takes them time uh, to to unload them for a variety of reasons, and maybe intentionally in some cases. But you see those sit in REO for a while before they're actually sold, and so then that kind of builds up that number.
which, with all that information, so the build up is to this little final segment before I let Darren go. He recently did another article. You have been everywhere. You did an article. I don't think you knew what the title was going to be, but when Michelle did the piece for Bloomberg, but the housing market is waving a red flag. And this was the reason I initially made my phone call. I
Mhm.
believe I had this discussion with Andrea Riccier, with a couple of journalists on the topic. And I don't know if necessarily what you'd call us in is a bubble. I think what you would call it is a unique period of time in real estate history that resembles closely to a bubble, but it's not quite a bubble because we don't have any of the volatile. I can't see anything volatile. I can't.
Yeah.
I literally, unless the equity firms all woke up and go, we're at the top of the market, and they pull, a Sam and start selling all their properties. What's his name in Chicago? Sam.
Um,
Yeah, him.
Seller.
Yes, he sold all his commercial and all his holdings in Chicago. He goes, I'm high enough. I'm out.
I'm good.
I'm
Yeah.
good. I'm good. I'm out. So if the equity firms wake up one morning and decide, yeah, we're at the top of the market, we're all selling, and they'll probably all sell about the same time, that's probably what will incite the next drop in value. Will be a flood of properties hitting the market all at once. But beyond that, I can't, like, the builders will never catch up. The demand is so ridiculous. The lending constraints are so tight. They're keeping people that are self-employed out of the market. I mean, it's a very engineered market. It's from a
Yeah.
banking standpoint, I'm very impressed with the market. It seems to be fairly solid, but the point being that it will have an equilibrium. Would you agree with the concept that we will eventually reach a tipping point to all of this?
Yes, yes, I do. I think from my knowledge of the last 10 years in the market and experience that we'll go through another down cycle. But, you know, what we went through 10 years ago
Was not.
it's not going to be exactly repeated. And it was probably more of a once in a generation or once in a 100-year type of an event. And so I do think we see bubbles forming in this market, and there are signs of over speculative behavior, which is what the Bloomberg article really was keen in on is behavior at foreclosure auctions
Yep.
because there's such strong demand. People are overpaying at foreclosure auctions, and we see a high percentage of homes going to investors at auctions because they're willing to pay a higher price, and the banks are happy to let that happen. But so I do see bubbles forming, but the question
Is it?
is it going to, is there some kind of hidden, sharp object that's floating around the bubble that's going to pop it? And I that's what I don't see, and that's I think what you're getting at. There's no
Yeah, there's no,
huge
I don't see,
fundamental
I could see
flaw.
him accelerating it more. I can see that. I can
Yeah.
see how to accelerate it more. Certainly from a banking standpoint, all you have to do, uh, there is no doubt in my mind, barring WikiLeaks really having something on Hillary, she's going to probably be elected as president. Her and her husband, their housing plans tend to indicate that everybody should own a house. So I would see them loosening up lending standards or certainly making FHA more available in some wider array. That presidency, I could see certainly finding a way to
Yes.
find more financing. And people, really don't send me or Darren emails. This is a historical fact. Go look it up. Okay, just go look it up. It's the same plan that her husband had, and it worked very well. It accelerated the prices exceptionally well, and it created value for people who owned homes. And there's nothing wrong with that. The problem is whatever goes up must inevitably come down. And I think it's always fun when I talk to you, Darren, to hypothesize. I can see going up, but really, what would cause like it
Well,
would?
the weakness, what you mentioned, I think is one threat is a flood of inventory, and really the main source of that would be some of these big hedge funds that own tens of thousands of homes. I I don't see that as a huge threat because that would
I think the
kind of
market can
shoot them
absorb it now.
in the
I
foot.
do.
And yes, the market could actually fairly easily absorb it. I think the certainly well, I think the other threat that's and it's not going to affect every market nationwide. It's really only a select number of markets is the global economy weakening and that lessening demand on the demand side from these foreign investors who have really propped up some of the coast, especially like coastal markets like San Francisco, where by the way, we this this is underreported as well, but we have seen a decline in San Francisco prices just over the last couple of months,
Wow.
which after about 49 consecutive months of increases. And in general, I was just looking at the high end numbers, the high end side of the market. If you look at sales volume has declined in out of the last 7 months, it's declined in 5 of the last 7 months sales volume. So there's some weakness there, kind of on these trophy markets and high end markets because of the global economy weakening. But it's again, it's not
It's not a
a,
sharp
a, a
object.
huge, widespread, sharp object. Yeah, that's going to
Right.
just
It's just a natural adjustment
yeah,
to the market in the end of summer. And really, at some point, we're going to find out that people just simply can't afford the prices we're getting at because the jobs don't. I mean, it will come down to jobs and
yes,
affordability. And
yeah,
ultimately, if you're the president, the smart play would be to increase minimum wage, which will then bump up the middle. But it's an ongoing game, it's an ongoing circular game. And as long as they do it, there's no reason for anybody who's holding the bigger story that broke thanks to Trump was the fact that we're at our lowest point in homeowner uh,
ownership rates. Yeah,
ownership rate in history. And it's not that dramatic. It's not really that big a deal as compared to, say, the inventory issue that we're having. But from a relative perspective, yeah, I guess if 40% of the market decided to sell all of their properties at once because they wanted top dollar, it might have a dramatic impact. But I don't think, I mean, for a lack of a better word, Wall Street doesn't own 40% of the properties. It's a mix of
yeah.
countries.
It's
It's a
like
mix.
it's if you look at the big hedge funds, the numbers sound big, but they're really only they're if you stretch, they're 5% of the market,
Yeah.
but I would say it's more like 2% for the real big guys. And so it's not a huge threat, but I do think something you said is key is that because you have this cycle of intervention in the market that really started with the homeownership type society. I think that was Clinton, and then
Yep.
Bush carried that on. That's ownership
Yep.
society.
Yep. Yep. Yep.
That, but that we're continuing to see the cycle of intervention to try to keep the market going. I think that's I you can't I don't know what it is yet, but that cycle is going to lead somewhere to just building a house of cards that's eventually going to fall. But again,
Yes.
I don't want to say that too strongly. There's no immediate threat, but I think that cycle is what will eventually lead to the market